Hi, my name is Andrew Evans, and in this video, I'm going to continue my conversation about Derek Bolton's book, What is Mental Disorder? In this video, we'll focus on chapter 3 of that book. So I recommend, if you haven't, watching my videos on chapter 1 and chapter 2, because they'll provide a good background for this as well. I also recommend watching my video on Jerome Wakefield's his paper, The Concept of Mental Disorder, because that will be a primary focus of this chapter. So, in this chapter, Bolton considers approaches to defining mental disorder that he refers to as naturalistic. So, we can understand naturalistic approaches as grounding mental disorder in natural, scientific, and biological facts rather than social norms. So, in other videos, I've talked about how norms are really relevant when we're wanting to understand what mental disorder is. Naturalistic approaches really ground mental disorder in biological norms, and that's distinguished by what is sometimes called normativism, that grounds mental disorder in social norms. So here we're focused on naturalistic approaches. So there are two big approaches that Bolton discusses. He discusses the theory of Christopher Borse at the beginning, but he only discusses that quickly, and then he mainly focuses on the theory of Jerome Wakefield. Most of the chapter is an explanation of Wakefield's account and Bolton's criticisms of it. Towards the end, Bolton ends up talking about how he actually thinks it's difficult to disentangle the natural and the social. He thinks that biological and social norms are sort of all tied up together. And this is kind of a major theme of his book. He's not sure if we can really make this distinction between what's medical, natural, biological on one hand, and social on the other hand. Now, in this video, I'm going to just briefly mention Christopher Borse and Bolton's criticism of his views, and then spend the rest of the video, on Jerome Wakefield. So I'm not going to get as much into talking about how he thinks it's difficult to disentangle natural and social. Instead, I'm going to focus on Wakefield's view and Bolton's criticism of Wakefield's view. And like I said, I would recommend you watching the Wakefield video first, because I give a more detailed account of Wakefield's view there. All right, so first, Borse. So this is Christopher Borse, and he's put forward a really influential theory of disorder. In different places, I think Borse refers to it differently as illness or disease, and he initially makes some distinctions between those terms. For my purposes, I'm just going to use the term disorder because that's more relevant to what Bolton is up to. So we can think of Borse's theory as this: a condition counts as a disorder if it decreases biological fitness. And here, biological fitness is understood as having to do with survival and reproduction. So, really, Borse's view is really close to R.E. Kendall's view on mental disorder, which I also have a video on, Kendall's approach. Borse thinks what's really important is biological fitness, and we can understand biological fitness in terms of having to do with survival and reproduction. Right? But there's also a statistical element to Borse's view. He thinks that the norm of biological fitness is understood in terms of statistical normativity. So a condition counts as a disorder if biological fitness is reduced below what is normal for some group. So we have to look at some group to determine if functioning has dropped below what is normal, right? So there's a statistical element to Borse's account as well. So for Borse, a condition is a mental disorder if it reduces biological fitness below what is statistically normal. And Bolton has several criticisms of Borse's account. He mentions, for example, that statistical abnormality in itself does not warrant clinical attention. So there are going to be situations in which some functioning falls below what's statistically normal, right? Biological fitness might be reduced to some extent, but that doesn't mean that this is something that deserves clinical attention or like the attention of healthcare in general, right? So he thinks that's a sort of weird analogy that Borse is making. He also notes that statistical rarity is not necessary for something to be considered a disorder. So we know that very well, right? Because the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, became very common. So just because something is actually normal doesn't mean it's no longer a disorder or an illness. And we can even see that with certain diagnoses like depression and anxiety tend to be fairly common. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're not disorders or illnesses. In some ways, Borst does respond to this criticism, but I'm just touching on it right here. And finally, it's difficult to determine what reference group is used as a comparison. So anytime we're talking about the statistical normality thing, we have to define what reference group someone's being compared against. So if I'm really anxious and if my anxiety reduces biological fitness, then Boris would say, okay, maybe that's a disorder. But we're also comparing my functioning to what's normal for a reference group. So the reference group would be maybe people of my age or people of my gender, people from the same area of me. But really, it's kind of unclear which group to use, right, in making these statistical comparisons. So that's another criticism that Bolton has of Bohr's, that we'd have to determine what the reference group is that we're judging people against, and that ends up being kind of difficult. All right, now we'll turn to Bolton's discussion of Jerome Wakefield. So here's just a summary of Wakefield's view, and it's from Wakefield. He says, quote, "I argue that a disorder is a harmful dysfunction, wherein harmful is a value term based on social norms, and dysfunction is a scientific term referring to a failure of mental mechanisms to perform a natural function for which it was designed by evolution." Now, Wakefield is often considered a hybrid theorist because what he's doing in this account is he's combining biological and social norms. He's saying that for something to be a mental disorder, it has to be there has to be a mental mechanism not functioning according to its evolutionary design. So that's the biological part. But there's also a social part. It also has to be harmful according to social norms. Okay, so he really combines the biological and the social. Now, Bolton doesn't talk much about the harmful part of Wakefield's approach. He acknowledges that it's there, but he really focuses on the dysfunction part. And that's why he refers to Wakefield as a naturalist or a naturalistic approach to mental health. He really sees that science-y part is what matters for Wakefield. And that's fair to some extent, but in a lot of other literature, sometimes Wakefield is referred to as a hybrid theorist because he combines the social with the biological. Okay. And just to distinguish between these two, right, Borse and Wakefield, they both ground mental disorder to various extents in biological functioning, right? Wakefield dips more into the social norms as well. But in terms of the biological functioning, Boris's interest in biological fitness, right, survival and reproduction, which is sort of forward looking, right? Does this condition reduce my biological fitness? Whereas Wakefield is interested in evolutionary design, which is backwards looking, right? He is interested, was I designed to do this? Is this anxiety normal for my design? For how evolution designed my mind to be, right? So there's a distinction here, even though they both kind of ground it in biological norms, they have different approaches to what biological norms are relevant. All right. So I just wanted to note that distinction between these two thinkers that Bolton talks about in this chapter. All right, so now we'll move on to Bolton's criticism of Wakefield. He actually thinks that Wakefield has the best naturalistic account of disorder, but he thinks it ultimately doesn't work. And here are three of his major criticisms. As I mentioned already, he thinks it's difficult to disentangle the social from the biological. He's not so sure we can actually distinguish, like, here are the evolutionary designed functions that are not social, right? They're not socially designed at all. He thinks that these kind of things go together and that our evolutionary history is social in many ways, right? So to disentangle these things, it's actually pretty difficult. Bolton also thinks that if we agree with Wakefield, then we would have to reconsider many conditions that exist in the DSM, right? Because for Wakefield, a condition has to be evolutionarily dysfunctional. Well, are the conditions in the DSM evolutionarily dysfunctional? It's actually really hard to tell. And that relates to his third criticism, which is from the clinic, we can't really distinguish whether or not a condition is evolutionarily dysfunctional, right? So ultimately, what Wakefield's interested in is was was my mind designed to behave this way? I'm very anxious. Well, if my mind was designed to be anxious in the circumstance, then it's not a disorder. But if my mind wasn't designed to be anxious in the circumstance, then it might be a disorder, right? So that's what he's interested in, is evolutionary design. But it's actually hard to distinguish, right, what conditions or sort of what our mind was designed to do, and certainly isn't possible from the clinic, right? When someone's trying to give someone a diagnosis, they can't determine whether or not something is evolutionarily designed or not. So that's one of Bolton's main criticisms of Wakefield. Now, in section 3.6 of chapter 3 here, Bolton discusses option one and option two. So after giving Wakefield's account and criticizing it, he considers, do we want to go with naturalism? And for him, Wakefield would be the best option. Or do we want to move away from naturalism and reject Wakefield and other naturalistic approaches to defining mental disorder? And he refers to this as option one and option two. So I really want to focus and get clear here on what these two options are, because Bolton has a view here that he pursues in chapter 4. Okay, option one, Wakefield is correct, right? Mental disorders are harmful evolutionary dysfunctions. So naturalism is correct. We can actually ground mental disorder in biological norms. So the concept of mental disorder is actually grounded in scientific facts. And at the clinic, we can only speculate if something counts as a mental disorder, because we really can't tell from the clinic whether or not something is evolutionarily dysfunctional or not. And there will be many conditions that cause a lot of distress and impairment that we would want to treat, but they would not technically count as mental disorders if they're not evolutionarily dysfunctional, right? So this is the first option. If we go with Wakefield, here are the consequences. We get to ground mental disorder in scientific facts, but there are some practical limitations, right? We're not sure what is evolutionarily dysfunctional or not. And plus, it seems like in mental health care, we want to treat conditions that cause distress, that cause suffering. And if they're not also dysfunctional, then they wouldn't count for Wakefield. So Wakefield doesn't say we can't treat non-disorders, but then it kind of is this weird terminological thing where it's like, okay, well, some things aren't disorders, but we still want to treat them. But some things that are real disorders, right, those are the evolutionarily dysfunctional ones. So that's option one. Option two is that Wakefield is wrong, right? Mental disorders aren't about evolutionary dysfunctions. Mental disorders are simply the conditions that the mental health community treats that cause distress and or impairment. So what are some implications of this option? Well, one, the conditions in the DSM would pretty much stay the same. They are already conditions that tend to involve distress or impairment, right? So there wouldn't be a shakeup, right, in the same way that there would be if we accepted Wakefield. And we can also tell from the clinic if someone has a mental disorder or not, right? Is this condition causing someone distress or impairment? It's more practical, this option. But the downside is that mental disorder isn't grounded in scientific facts, right? There's no biological thing we can point to say this is a real disorder. So this opens the field back up to anti-psychiatry criticisms that the field is pathologizing normal problems in living, right? Ultimately, it's about social norms again, right? It's about what's harmful, what's causing distress, not about some underlying biological dysfunction. And we saw in our video from the video I talked about Thomas Saz, there's criticism of mental health care if it's just grounded in what we consider to be harmful rather than some sort of biological fact. So Bolton considers these two options, and I think it's just really important to get clear on these two options to understand his book, because I think he's really grappling with these two options. What are the consequences of taking one route or the other? Ultimately, Bolton thinks that it doesn't make sense to take a naturalistic approach to mental disorder. So no matter which of the two options we take, he thinks that the mental health field is just going to continue to treat conditions that cause distress or impairment, whether or not we want to call these mental disorders or not. So I think he just doesn't think that biological norms and like this idea of evolutionary dysfunction is all that relevant to treating suffering, right? And that ultimately what we're up to in mental health care is treating conditions of suffering, conditions that cause distress. So that's what he pursues in chapter 4. He pursues a non naturalistic approach to understanding mental disorder. He thinks that would be best. All right, well, that is all I have for this video. Thank you for watching.